why is China's economy shrinking for the first time in decades? Because for over a decade, we've all been told that China is going to eventually overtake the United States as the world's premier economic superpower. And the story seemed to almost write itself. China had been the fastest growing economy for decades, and most economists and politicians alike were predicting that the country would overtake the United States in just a few years. But now, China appears to be in the middle of a massive crisis. Not only has the growth slowed, the Chinese economy is now shrinking. In fact, the economic gap between the US and China is now widening for the first time since the end of the Cold War. So, what happened? I mean, how did China convince the entire world that they were on the verge of overtaking the United States? And how did it all go so wrong? And in order to answer that question, we need to travel back more than 40 years. Because in the 1980s, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. After decades of rule under Mao, China had experienced famines, purges, and complete elimination of private property. And the result was catastrophic. Just the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution alone are estimated to have killed as many as 60 million people through famine and purges. And that doesn't even include any of the other disastrous policies that the ruling communist regime pursued. In short, by the time of Mao's death in 1976, China was in shambles. The economy had almost completely collapsed, and a new generation of political leaders began looking for answers. And it was during this time that China began to open up to the rest of the world. Under the leadership of reformers like Deng Xiaoping, China began to gradually introduce market-based policies. Property rights began to return to China after half a century of almost complete government ownership. Agriculture was no longer collectivized. They even allowed farmers to manage their own land and sell surplus produce in the markets. The country embraced a policy of free trade for the first time in history. Special economic zones were set up to encourage foreign investment. Price controls were lifted, and stock exchanges were reopened after being closed for more than 40 years. Now, combined, these free market reforms granted China only a fraction of the economic freedom in the US and Europe, but the result was still a miracle. China's government might have been communist, but China's economy grew by leaps and bounds the more free it became. But now, all of that's starting to change. China is stagnating. Its population is shrinking, and enormous bubbles are imploding for things like real estate all over the marketplace in China. Now, admittedly, all of these things have happened to countries that don't have a communist party. So why is it so much worse for China? Well, because while China began to embrace market reforms, it still maintained a totalitarian communist government. And under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China has steadily rolled back many of the old market reforms that had been embraced in the 80s and 90s. There's been sweeping crackdowns on China's tech sector and the stock market, banning of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, outlawing private education, and the growing power of state-owned enterprises are all back on the rise. In short, the CCP is now reverting back to its old Marxist roots, with Xi Jinping increasingly becoming more like Mao. And that's why China's emerging economic crisis is about to get a whole lot worse. The problem is that while China had flirted with free market reforms a generation ago, it was just that, a flirtation. The CCP thought it could have the benefits of a free market economy while maintaining an authoritarian regime. The problem is, there will never be a shortage of politicians, bureaucrats, and rent seekers who always push for cronyism and control, which is only exacerbated in a totalitarian state. China is about to learn what Hayek warned us all about, namely, that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. Do you have a why you would like us to answer? Go into the link in the description and pose your question, and maybe the next Why Minutes will be dedicated to you.